Okay, well, let me call the meeting to order. I want to welcome and thank you all for attending. This is a public meeting, and Michelle, is this being recorded for future access?
It is.
It is, great. So there is a recording in case somebody needs to drop off but wants to listen to it later. Angela, could you please take a roll call of the members? I think there's only 3 of us, but
Sorry. Town of Hillsborough,
present.
City of Daly City,
Present.
City of Millbrae.
Present.
Okay, let the record show that all members are present, so clearly we have a quorum. The first item on the agenda is a public comment for items not on the agenda. We are doing this call by Zoom in accordance with state orders. And all members and staff are meeting offline, practicing appropriate social distancing. Members of the public may view and listen to the meeting as noted on the agenda, and members of the public may provide public comments via the Zoom platform by using the raise hand feature, or if calling in by phone by pressing *9 on the telephone keypad. If a member of the public wants to provide public comments on agenda item or non-agenda item during the general public comment, they shall request to speak by using the raise hand feature on Zoom prior to the close of the public comment period for either agenda or non-agenda items. In response, we will unmute the speaker and allow them to speak for up to 3 minutes. All members of the public will be limited to 1 comment per agenda item and 1 comment for non-agenda items. And we may be a little flexible on that with agenda items depending on the time we have. Okay. Before we move into the chairman's update, Angela, do we have any written comments before we get public comments, do we have any written comments that have been provided?
Thank you, Chair. We did not receive any written comments.
Okay, do we have any raised hands for public comment?
I do see 1 hand raised for public comment. I'll go ahead and let any other members queue up if they would like to speak. And if you give me 1 second, I will share my timer. Okay, so I will first call on Sue Degree. Sue, please accept this request to unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
Hello, Sue, how are you? Is Sue unmuted?
Sue, please accept the request to unmute your microphone.
Thank you. I couldn't find the unmute button. Thank you very much. Thank you 3 for being on the legislative committee. I hope I'm not overstepping I'm not that familiar with the agenda, but these things have been concerning me and I do have to drop off because of work, is that the elevating vehicles, they're not helicopters, but they're potential cars and they're going to be elevating like a helicopter. What I don't know is how much noise they're going to make. The other thing I'm concerned about is drones. We already know drones make noise. So there's going to be a proliferation of both of these things in due time. And I haven't heard much talk at all about how much noise they may make. And they're obviously going to have flight paths, etc. And they're in production. So engineers are making these things. I think it would be great to be ahead of the game so that engineers can actually be paying attention and we don't have the fight we had with next gen over this other wonderful next gen that has caused us so much grief. So those are my concerns at the moment. And I appreciate again that you're being legislative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. I might note that the council is not permitted under the Brown Act to respond directly on any items not on the agenda. We could ask clarifying questions. And so we may come back to the council, to the members, see if they have any clarifying questions. But I thank you for your comments, Sue. I would only note that there was a fair amount of discussion on this at the recent UC Davis symposium. And one of our speakers may or may not speak on this as part of the presentation if it regards coming legislation, but it is a topic that's been noted and one that we share your concern over. Are there other public comments?
Thank you, Chairman. I do not have any more hands raised for
Okay, with that, we will close public comment, and I'll take it back to the membership, to the members, see if they have any questions of the public comment section. Ann, do you have any questions or?
Me? Did I raise my hand?
No, I'm asking each of the two members if you
No.
have any questions of Sue with respect to what you said. Pamela?
No, Chair, not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda is the chairman's update. And the only update I really have is I want to just give you for the record, indicate the results of the last meeting we had. As you recall, we did take feedback for the purposes of writing a letter to the FAA in response for their request for input on the noise study. That's my words, not the official title. And we did draft that letter. We submitted it to the full roundtable at their April meeting for their, number one, their awareness of it and any feedback they might have. They had no comments with respect to substantive changes to the letter, but the letter was well received and I think echoed the sentiments of the membership and told, not just our sentiments. And we did submit that letter on April 13th. A copy of that letter is attached in your agenda packet, as well as a couple other letters along the same lines from, one is from the Oakland equivalent and another is from five cities and on border that East Palo Alto and Palo Alto Menlo Park, and a couple others I forget off the top of my head. So those letters are attached in the packet as well for your information. With that, let's move on to the main agenda for today, and that's the discussion on federal legislation. The purpose of this is to give us both background of what's going on with proposed legislation and information for discussion of our next steps. I would remind us that our overall mission is to achieve measurable noise reduction in our communities. So legislation around achieving measurable noise reduction is critical to what we do. Before we start, if you look at the agenda, there is a quick summary of the roundtable work plan. Michelle, would you like to walk through those 3 bullet items or
Well, I guess the approved roundtable work plan includes for goal 3 for this next year is to lobby for aircraft noise reduction with an action item of actively monitoring, reviewing, and opposing or supporting legislation, research, or aircraft noise reduction programs. And the work plan tasks are to receive regular reports from the noise organization, which they are giving us and we are giving them, actively monitor activities at the Congressional Quiet Skies Caucus, and Kathleen will give us an update on that today, lobby and advocate as needed, and work with congressional delegation to help develop and pass noise-related legislation.
Thank you. Okay. That is our objective is laid out in the work plan. Just wanted to share it with everybody as we go through this so we have a framework under which we're operating. With that, we have 3 presentations to talk about pending legislation or potential legislation. I don't know if they're all present, Michelle, are they?
They are. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I think we're starting with Mr. Kirsch. I think Peter Kirsch is a partner with Kaplan, Kirsch, and Rockwell. His presentation will focus on the next Congress priorities, perspectives, and predictions. So Mr. Kirsch, we'll turn the floor over to you, as they say, and welcome, by the way. We appreciate you being with us today.
Mr. Kirsch, you're
I should unmute before I start speaking, shouldn't I? Thank you. It's good to be here. You'd think after a year and something we would have figured out where the unmute button was, but some of us are just slow learners. What can I say? Well, it's good to be here. I think it's a little daunting to say I'm going to give predictions about Congress because anybody who thinks they can predict what Congress is going to do is either really brilliant or really stupid, and I'm just not going to say which one I am for the moment. But all joking aside, and Kathleen Wentworth is clearly in a much better position to talk about what's going on in Congress now. What I thought I would do, Justin suggested I reprise a presentation that I made some months ago at the UC Davis conference that talks about the context here, both from a regulatory and from a legislative perspective, what's probably going to go on with very little discussion of very specifics of legislation, but more about the tone of what we're facing. And with your permission, Mr. Chair, I'd like to put up a PowerPoint and just walk through that if that's okay.
That would be excellent. Angela, do you have?
Let's see. I've got it here. Do you want me to do that, or do you want to do it from your end? What's easier?
I'm fine with you doing it, sir.
Okay. Okay. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Let me just make sure that I'm doing this right. Okay, good. So we need to start out, it seems to me, with some basic understanding of the science of what we're dealing with. Anybody who's been dealing with noise for the last 50 years or so knows about the Schultz curve. And anybody who has been paying attention to noise for the last month or two knows about the new national curve. I want to go back and forth between these, because this curve is what has historically been used in policymaking at the federal level in terms of understanding the percent of people who are highly annoyed by noise and at what level those percentages apply. As a matter of policy, and I'm going to come to explain some of the history of this, 65 decibels DNL has been viewed as the level at which the percent highly annoyed is significant enough that the federal government should do something about that. We switched to the national curve, which looks entirely different. This is based upon the neighborhood environmental study, and I think, Mr. Chair, you referred to it as the noise annoyance study, which is probably a more accurate description of what the study is. But it's a very different curve, both in terms of shape and in terms of where it sits on the axis. So we need to remember these are very different curves, and the implications are very significant. So how did we get where we are today? And the historical context is awfully important for understanding what we do in the future. There have been any number of studies of noise annoyance going back certainly to 1979 and arguably quite a bit longer before that. And some of them have very easily remembered names like FICON, FICAN. Don't ask me which is which, because I always get them mixed up. But I want to focus particularly on 1979 because it's a really critical year for understanding current policy. In 1979, Congress passed the Airport Safety and Noise Act. That statute was really the statute that created the Part 150 program. That is the program whereby the FAA funds noise mitigation using federal AIP money. The reason that's important is it was the first time that Congress dictated what, how, and when the federal government should analyze noise on a government-wide basis. And it said that the FAA is to establish a single system for measuring noise. And in doing so, is to consider the factors that go into federal decision-making, including science and economics. And that's really important to understand that the direction to the FAA was based both on science and economics. The context was the creation of the Part 150 program, the program that funds noise mitigation. So it's important to recognize that when ENZA directed the FAA to establish a single methodology, a single system of measuring noise, it was in the context of federal funding for noise mitigation. So let's then fast forward to today. The neighborhood environmental study is likely to provide a new foundation for all legal discussions about noise going forward. And it is going to put pressure on the regulators, on the legislators, and on airport sponsors themselves to adapt to these findings. Now, it's really critical to remember that the neighborhood environmental study is a data point. It's a data point among literally hundreds of studies around the world on annoyance and people's reaction to noise. It's an important data point, but it's a data point. And it leads to the question that a lot of communities have asked as to whether it remains legally permissible to continue to rely on the 65 dB DNL threshold that was established as a result of congressional direction after 1979. And I'll give you the answer, and the rest of the presentation will explain why. But the answer is yes, it does remain legally permissible to continue to rely on the 65 dB DNL threshold. So let me walk through some of the legal considerations here. First of all, as I mentioned a moment ago, the DNL metric and the 65 threshold was developed for a very narrow purpose in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It was part of the ASNA obligation that FAA adopt a single system for measuring noise. And it was in the context of federal funding for noise. Now, the use of both the metric and the threshold evolved, gradually becoming more widespread over the course of the last 40 plus years. Although originally designed for a single purpose, it is now enshrined in law, in regulations, in policy, guidance, and past practice and legal precedents that, in essence, and I'm oversimplifying here, that there is no noise outside the 65 dB DNL threshold, and there is noise inside. Now, obviously, I'm oversimplifying here, but the principle is important, which is that the single metric and the single threshold was established in one context, and it has evolved over time to be used in many other contexts. One of the reasons it's evolved is because the courts tend to defer to the FAA expertise, and the FAA was given the direction by Congress to establish the single system. And so absent arbitrary and capricious decision-making, the courts have deferred to that. And that has, in a sense, strengthened the value both of the metric and the threshold. It's really important as we look to congressional policymaking going forward to distinguish the metric and the threshold, the metric being DNL, the threshold being 65, because the criticisms or the bases to rely upon or criticize each is very, very different. And it's really important to understand that the neighborhood environmental study was really focused on the question of the threshold, not the metric. That is, does 65 dB DNL remain the right threshold for assessing significant noise impact, not is DNL the right metric. So the question now, is legislative change necessary? That is, Congress made a direction in 1979 and it hasn't spoken to this issue definitively since then. Do we need legislative change to adapt to what we've learned from the neighborhood environmental study? Well, anything going forward is of necessity going to have to be transparent and thoughtful and collaborative. And if anybody has looked at the comments that the FAA solicited on the neighborhood environmental study, this theme appears throughout. Now, one last legal consideration to keep in mind, and this is particularly true in California, is state law does not have ASNA. It does not have FAA deference. It has, in your case, it has CEQA. And the question is there now a basis under CEQA to challenge the legitimacy of the 65 dB threshold? That's a really interesting but entirely different question than the question as to the federal issues. So what do we do now? I mean, there are a lot of choices. You know, we can just scream and yell and talk about how we now have a new data point that calls into question the scientific basis or the technical basis upon which 65 was established in 79. But really, I think it's better, instead of just sitting here and grousing about it, to look at the long and winding road going forward as to what's going to happen. And I really see four different paths, if you will. One is that the first three all deal with the FAA. One is the FAA makes some tweaks and shows flexibility in the use of the threshold in various different contexts, environmental context, perhaps, AIP funding context, maybe in context outside NEPA, outside the Environmental Policy Act, but make some tweaks. And by the way, that's going on already today. Already today, the FAA is using other thresholds and frankly, other metrics as supplemental information in a lot of environmental documents. Second path is there's no change at all. The FAA says, interesting data point. We have lots of other data points. There's no basis to change our policy. And the third, and perhaps least likely, is the FAA says, oh my gosh, goodness be, we've been wrong all these years. Let's start over from scratch. Unlikely, legally possible, but extremely unlikely. The fourth path involves Congress, and I think in many respects may be the most likely of all these paths, in which the FAA wrings their hands and says, what are we going to do? Do we tweak? Do we not make changes? Do we have a whole new regulatory structure? And Congress tells them what to do. And I think that's likely to be something that comes down the road relatively soon. Now, remember the FAA's position with respect to the Neighborhood Environmental Survey, and that is that it will not act until it considers public and other stakeholder input along with any additional research needed to improve the understanding of the effects of aircraft noise exposure on communities. This is the FAA statement. In other words, let me translate that into plain English. We ain't going to do nothing until we look at this more in detail. And I think that's consistent with what a lot of people are suggesting. Again, this data point is useful, but there needs to be a much more thorough examination. So in the meantime, while the FAA examines these other studies and has a process, do we sprint forward, assuming that the neighborhood environmental survey is the end all, or do we put our heads in the sand? And I would suggest there are some reasonable options in between those for the FAA in particular. One is that the agency could make agency-wide revisions in either the metric or the threshold. While that is permissible, I think that is not particularly likely, but it's something they could do. They could also make changes in either the threshold or the metric for very particular purposes. For environmental reviews under NEPA, for Section 4F of the Transportation Act, for looking at parks and wildlife areas, National Historic Preservation Act. It could make changes for Part 150, for Part 161 for noise studies, airport revenue use, and the use of AIP or PFC funding. I mean, these are all different ways that over time, 65 and DNL has been enshrined as the single metric and the single threshold for all these purposes. And the FAA could say, we only are required by Congress to have a single metric for Part 150, and we could make revisions elsewhere. That's a really complicated process of deciding what metric and what threshold we use in different contexts. And also remember that I only talk here about the FAA. There are other government agencies that look at noise data that use DNL and 65, and they too are going to have to consider the options going forward. So let's talk about what we're facing right now in the current administration, because I think in many respects, the timing of the release of the neighborhood environmental study is particularly interesting. I note for those of you who are either conspiracy theorists or people who really, have some global theory of how government works, that the neighborhood environmental survey was released just moments before the end of the last administration, and quite literally moments before the FAA associate administrator resigned his position. Whether that's significant or not, I'll leave to people's speculation. I'm not going to comment on that. But what's really important is that the new administration has a new focus on climate change and environmental justice. And in many respects, aircraft noise issues do directly affect environmental justice and to a lesser extent, climate change. In light of that focus on action by this administration, will the public and the Congress accept more studies, which is very, very common approach to problems like this. I believe, frankly, that there's pressure to act now, and I'm hoping that some of your later speakers will talk a little bit more about that pressure. But the question is, what does the transition look like? This is not the kind of situation where one day Congress can say, you've always used 65 DNL, now we want you to use a different number because of the ripple effects. And the last potential implication to think through, and this applies particularly in California, but other states as well, is are there going to be legal challenges to the continued use of the 65 dB DNL threshold on the basis that there is now scientific data questioning its reliability? Are the FAA's NEPA documents arbitrary and capricious? I wouldn't be half surprised if there are legal challenges, and I think that's one of the imperatives that Congress is going to face in trying to address this issue, so this is not decided on a piecemeal basis by courts. The one thing there's growing consensus about is that there is no consensus. And the ACINA in their comments to the FAA said it's critical for the agency to take into account and to reflect the different experiences in different communities. Now think about that for just a moment. In 1979, Congress said establish a single system. And FAA said, we're going to establish a single metric and a single threshold. And ACI, the industry group for airports, is now saying, just a second here, guys, different experiences in different communities. With no insult intended to particular communities, my guess is acceptable noise levels in Queens, New York are not the same as acceptable noise levels in Aspen, Colorado. Different communities expect different levels of noise. And so ACI is endorsing the idea that maybe this idea that one size fits all, maybe that's outdated. Maybe that was fine in 1979, maybe not today. In Congress, we're seeing increasing attention by members, and you're going to hear this, I think, from some of the future speakers, that my community deserves different treatment. My community is special. After all, that's what Congressmen exist for, right? To protect their district. But there's going to be increasing pressure to say, whatever the FAA does elsewhere, you have to use a different metric in my community, or you have to use a different metric for this project. Alternative and supplemental metrics are becoming both not alternative and not supplemental. They almost become standard practice. That is, most FAA environmental documents, many Part 150 documents, many other noise-related environmental studies are now looking at not just DNL, not just 65, but alternative metrics and alternative thresholds. The other growing consensus is that local determinations on land use compatibility are increasingly important. And by that, I mean that the FAA has long said that if a community adopts land use compatibility standards that are more stringent than the FAA's, the FAA will respect those. And there are literally a handful of communities around the country that have done so, because it has significant economic impacts for the communities as well. But I think you're going to see a little more of that as well. So what are the implications of making any change in either the threshold or the metric? And I just list here a number of places where the changes would have really very significant public disclosure impacts, and frankly, pretty significant financial impacts as well. Everything from the scope of environmental reviews to the extent to which the FAA is required to protect parks under 4F, to airspace redesign and whether environmental assessments now have to be environmental impact statements, and on and on and on. So these are not simple decisions of simply disclosing more noise if the FAA were to, or if Congress were to direct that the FAA abandon the 65 threshold. So let me end briefly, and I'm a little bit out of my league here because I know Kathleen Wentworth's going to talk about this in more detail, but let me talk a little bit about congressional interest and oversight and statutory revisions that I think are under consideration. I don't have to tell you that the Quiet Skies Caucus has grown in size. It has absolutely grown in importance right now, given the fact that the same party controls the White House, the House, and the Senate. Whether that will continue for more than past 2022, anybody's guess. But the Quiet Skies Caucus is increasingly important. And you can look at this list of names and you'll see why I say that. So we have seen in recent years a fair amount of district-specific legislation. That is, a member who proposes legislation just for their district. This legislation is successful a reasonable portion of the time, less than half, but certainly more than 10% of the time. It often gets adopted as riders to other legislation, the National Defense Authorization Act, or to an FAA Authorization Act when that comes up, sometimes to appropriations bills. And Congresswomen Bass and Spear have particularly pressed on having noise issues addressed through the infrastructure legislation, an effort that is likely to pass the germaneness requirement, that is, it's likely to be appropriated in this legislation. Whether it passes Congress is anybody's guess at this point. But it's important to recognize that linkage that they have made between noise relief and infrastructure legislation. And lots of things are going to be tied into infrastructure legislation. And so I think the probabilities of legislation on this topic increase somewhat because of the pendency of this bill. And I think you're going to see more congressional attacks on this sort of one-size-fits-all from the 1979 ASNA bill, both on the type of noise and the type of community. So other congressional hot topics where we're likely to see some legislative attention. One is Metroplex and NextGen. The level of community concern about Metroplex and NextGen nationwide is overwhelming, and the appropriateness of the DNL metric to assess essentially not airport noise, but en route noise is something that's been subject to a lot of studies and a lot of congressional interest. That will continue. We're likely to see Congress talk about the threshold, the 65 threshold in particular. Whether Congress will take it on a frontal attack or on a sort of piecemeal attack remains to be seen. But I think you're likely to see legislation allowing local flexibility on restrictions, that is, to adopt restrictions on aircraft based not on the 65 DNL threshold, but to allow restrictions based upon local needs, and thereby revising the requirements in the Airport Noise and Capacity Act of 1990 and Part 161, which is the process whereby airports can impose restrictions. We are I would say regrettably, but we are, whether you agree with me or not, likely to see Congress push for more studies. Studies are a very good way for Congress to elevate the focus on an issue without having to get into controversial policy making or decision making. And so maybe there'll be another FICAN, what vowel do we want? FICIN. Maybe this will be FICIN. I don't know what that stands for, but in other words, I mean, there may be another interagency study on noise. There may be an independent review of the appropriateness of the 65 threshold or a blue ribbon commission. These are all things that members of Congress have discussed and I think are reasonably likely to come about. So let me end there. I know that this presentation is going to be available on a PDF for members of the committee. And I've just put in the back here for your information a bunch of key statutes and key regulations for those of you who want to refer back to it. So I spoke fast and long, but I'm happy to answer questions that folks may have at this point, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Just as a point, we will take public comment at the end of all three presentations, but after each presentation, we'll allow the members and staff to ask any questions, make any comments. So, Mr. Kirsch, thank you very much for that presentation. Very informative. I always learn something, even though I heard that before when I listened to you. So thank you.
Well, I hope it wasn't different than before.
No, pretty consistent. You obviously are not in elective office. It would be different. Let's start with Ann. Did you have any questions or comments on the context and the contours of what might be going on?
Of course I do. But first of all, thank you, Mr. Kirsch. That was really good. And I'm going to have to listen to it at least a couple of more times to be able to internalize it. I work in the environmental field, but I find noise is something that needs many reads. It's not intuitive. Okay, let's look at the neighborhood study, which did not look at neighborhoods in back of where jets take off. So it didn't include low frequency noise. We included that in our letter. What would you think is our approach to make sure that the other forms of noise that the FAA hasn't been looking at are included in the future?
Well, I think there. Is my mic on? Yes. I think there are a couple issues here. The first is a strategic issue that I'm not going to provide you advice on, and that is, do you want more studies or not? And there's a lot of diversity of thought on that question. If you want more studies, then studying is essentially replicating the neighborhood environmental survey for low frequency noise, for as you describe it, in neighborhoods behind the airport would be a very good subject for study. If you don't want that, then the question is there enough data out there for the FAA to make that distinction and to use a particular metric or a particular threshold in one side of the airport and the other? Today, under the 1979 law, FAA does not have that flexibility, but that would be something Congress could direct the FAA to do. That is to use, let's say, 65 and DNL for the departure noise in one direction, but use a different metric and a different threshold at the other end of the airport. So I think there's a lot of flexibility here if we're going to begin talking about flexibility. And that's really, to me, the most important issue is, can we start talking about that?
Okay. And then the second one, and I think you mentioned this. If, you know what, Al, could you take someone else? Let me put my question together.
Sure.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Kirsch.
My pleasure.
Pam, did you have any questions or comments? None? Let me see if any members of the staff, and I'm going to be pretty flexible in this. So if you have, just raise your hand. Michelle? Did you have
Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Sure.
Really appreciate it. And I actually heard your presentation at the Noise Forum and did see the changes you made. So thank you for that. What I did wanted to ask you about had to do with your comment that different communities have adopted their own noise thresholds and measurements based upon local needs, not 65 CNEL. Can you tell me what communities that is? Because I think I'll research a little bit more about that, the process that they did it.
I don't know all of them. I know at least two, and they're important. One is Naples, Florida. And the reason that's important is that the FAA allowed Naples to analyze noise impacts based upon a 60 DNL threshold because the community had adopted local zoning and land use restrictions in the 60. Another is Minneapolis. And the FAA allowed, in that instance, allowed the airport to spend money to mitigate noise to the 60 DNL, not 65, notwithstanding Part 150, because the local land use restrictions, the local land use compatibility guidelines were drafted to 60. And there's several more. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but it's a very controversial issue in local governments, because if you start restricting residential in 60 around an airport, that gets to be a very big area, and there's a lot of pushback. And in fact, we've worked with many communities where members of the community say, yes, absolutely, let's use 60 as the threshold. And then they look at how many homes are in the 60s. Well, maybe that's not such a good idea. And that's exactly that kind of push and pull that the FAA wants to take place. It's taking place right now outside Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, where there's a real push about that. So it's a topic of discussion increasingly.
Thank you.
Are there
Through the
any-
chair,
Yes.
I just thought, I apologize for my delay in my question.
No,
So Mr. Kirsch, thank you very much. The first time I've heard your presentation, very informative. In the neighborhood studies, I know that Congress, like you said, that time is everything, you know, like we need to push. But what I was asking about the equitable part of it, when people are like saying like one community doesn't fit all or whatever, but to put an equitable component to it in our legislation, because it is socioeconomics and it is defined by neighborhoods of color or Latinos or people, working people, and how they live near certain high levels and how the health impacts. I believe that it was our chair that brought out the health at the last meeting impacts. So how to implement that? We need to put that, make sure that that's in legislation, and that is that a hot point, obviously, for Congress. And I know that
Yes,
Kathleen will
it
be
is.
coming on.
Yeah, it's absolutely something Congress is thinking about. But let me caution you about unintended consequences. And I'll
Okay.
tell you just a very short war story here. I mean, I'm not going to identify the community just to protect the innocent, as they say.
Sure.
So we were representing an airport where there was very significant noise impacts around the airport. It was a large airport. And the question was, were homes around the airport that were exposed to noise at 70 CNEL, DNL, whether those homes were not selling, as whether this was affecting the market value. What we discovered, much to our surprise, is that homes under the 70 contour were selling faster than other homes in the community. Why? Well, it turns out that this particular community, housing prices were through the roof. And homes in the 70 were less expensive for obvious reasons. And in fact, as an economic matter, as an environmental justice issue, the homeowners there wanted those homes because they could afford a home instead of living in a condo very far away from the airport. A lot of airport workers, and they had beautiful 4-bedroom homes for the amount that they could pay get a 1-bedroom condo somewhere else. And so it was really counterintuitive to us that, in fact, I don't want to ever say noise helps people, but the noise provided an economic benefit to people who couldn't otherwise afford to live near the airport. Really interesting problem. And I think it's the kind of problem that both Congress and local policymakers have to deal with. Do we want to allow people to live near an airport when their otherwise alternative would be a long commute away? Really tough issue. So just be careful about unintended consequences there.
that's interesting. Were there other questions from the members of the staff? Kathleen or Bert or Linda or Justin? If there are none, let me ask one question, and then Ann, I think you had another question. I was interested in your comments around potential state action, and particularly California and the CEQA application to it. Have we had experiences, or are you aware of experiences with similar actions being brought in other states under state law to challenge the thresholds and the system and all?
Not many. There was one in Minnesota that was successful. And that's what established the principle that the airport could, and under Minnesota law, had to mitigate to the 60 DNL. There was an interesting recent case out of San Diego County in which an EIR was found to be deficient in its noise analysis. and the project was later withdrawn, and so it doesn't have any long-term implications there. But I think that it is not at all unlikely that you're going to find an aggressive litigant who can find a community in California, because California CEQA is way stronger than most other state comparable statutes, with the possible exception of New York. And so I think if there's going to be new law made in this area, it's most likely to be in California.
Okay. I think we could find a couple of communities, by the way.
Well, I mean, I think it's a really interesting problem, because of course the question is, under state law, does the neighborhood environmental survey undermine the basis under CEQA, for example, for relying on 65? And it's a question the state government hasn't yet addressed, but I fully expect that they will sooner than the FAA will.
Okay, great. And let me turn it back to you. You had another question?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councilman DiGiovanni. You were going where I'm going. This morning, I was on a call with Sacramento's Senate committee dealing on budget and cap and trade dollars, and there was a great deal of discussion on equity and social justice communities of concern. So none of the communities close into the airport, with the exception of maybe some neighborhoods in San Bruno, are considered communities of concern. And for Pamela's case up in Daly City, it's not considered a community of concern in this case. I don't really want to make Millbrae a community of concern, except as I watched how the state of California is funding environmental mitigation, including cap and trade, which is a lot of air pollution, it is being used on an equity model. So how do we balance that need for, and I would say even Palo Alto, clearly Palo Alto is not going to be a community of concern. And yet they're dealing with noise impacts, which could make them a community of concern if noise was actually used as one of the metrics. And I have been diving around with different CARB meetings, California Air Resources Board meetings, over the last month or two, trying to learn more about how to designate communities so we might be able to get mitigation dollars for whatever that mitigation might be. This morning, the state is putting $5 million aside for urban greening. And I spoke on, well, urban greening isn't just a heat island thing. For a very tiny degree, it can help with noise. So where do we go with community of concern? I certainly don't want Millbrae to take power away from East Palo Alto, which is almost entirely community of color with a lower income base. And yet my community is also a majority minority community, but not the right minority. So I'm just trying to figure out where to go.
It's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that because there's, as you point out, a really important trade-off there. The good news is that mitigation dollars on the noise side are relatively generous. I mean, compared to other kinds of mitigation, we may argue the FAA hasn't spent enough on noise mitigation, but the magnitude of the FAA dollars for noise mitigation dwarf most other federal environmental mitigation dollars, and so there is some hope there. The real question is, if you start expanding the pie, more and more communities become eligible. What does that mean to addressing noise in the areas that are most seriously affected? So I think it's a real problem, and one of the reasons I think that it's most difficult to look at expanding the scope of who is entitled to noise mitigation.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments to Mr. Kirsch before we move to the next presentation? Seeing none,
Mr. Chair, if I may, I apologize. I may have to sign off the meeting a little early because I've got another meeting at 1 o'clock your time. So.
Well, we very much appreciate you being here. Before you do that, though, I see Michelle has your hand up. Oh, you did not? I'm sorry. Okay.
I think she was just saying goodbye, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, well,
I will turn off my camera so you don't have to see any more of me, at least.
You raised some excellent points. I've got like 5 areas of additional information that may pose an opportunity for us, at least from your presentation.
Well, and I will argue, Mr. Chair, that I think that no one ever wants to be the pointy end of the spear, or sort of the bleeding edge, but around the San Francisco Bay Area, you are facing the problems in a more complex way than perhaps anywhere else in the country. I mean, you not only have, if you will, traditional noise mitigation problems at SFO and mitigating the noise from arrival and departures. But all you have to do is go down to the South Bay and recognize you've got a lot of problems with Metroplex at the same time. And then you add a lot of smaller airports that are all mixed in, and how to pull these apart in a way that equitably divides mitigation dollars is way more complicated, I would argue, in the Bay Area than perhaps anywhere else in the country.
Great. Thank you. I am sensitive to making sure we adhere to time schedule. So we're now going to move on to the next presentation. Justin, I believe you're going to give us an update on 117 Congress legislative update with respect to that, an overview. So floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Everyone? Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you. So my goal today is really to provide just an overview status of aircraft noise and emissions legislation in the 117th Congress that includes bills that were previously introduced. So I will try to summarize those the best that I can to kind of get everyone up to speed. The first two here, the Safe and Quiet Skies Act and the Air Traffic Noise and Pollution Expert Consensus Act, those bills have already been reintroduced into the 117th Congress. I will go through those a little bit later on a summary. The next two by Representative Adam Smith, they're expected to be reintroduced soon. And I also have some language to kind of discuss the language that was from the previous introduced bill to go over with you. The other ones listed here, it's unclear if these will be reintroduced from Representative Grace Meng, Joe Negussi, and Don Bayer. Let's see here, if I could get my computer to work here. Okay, lastly, obviously, we have from Jackie Spears' office, the, I would say 8 acts that Kathleen has shared with us before in terms of summary. And I will be going through each of those just as a kind of an overview and a reminder to get everyone back up to speed. I think it's been a while since we've actually looked at those. So one of the ones that have already been reintroduced is the Safe and Quiet Skies Act. This isn't necessarily, I would say, applicable to our area, but it applies to commercial air tours and notably requires tour flights fly above 1,500 feet over actual ground at all times. It also requires tour flights over occupied areas to be no louder than a particular dB level. In this case, it was 55 dBA. The Air Traffic Noise and Pollution Expert Consensus Act would require a report issued by the National Academy of Sciences. Some of you are familiar with the ACRP, or Airport Cooperative Research Program, and those would be on health effects over residential areas. It also would require them to convene a committee on health experts to analyze or examine the impacts of air traffic noise and pollution. For the two that would be soon reintroduced or expected to be reintroduced, the Aviation Impacted Communities Act would have really focuses on sound insulation or noise mitigation and increasing the funds in communities outside the 65 DNL noise contour. And aviation impacted would be defined as communities located within 1 mile of a commercial route that is 3,000 feet or lower. And then Obviously, I said that it would significantly expand the current limits of sound insulation efforts and look outside, basically neighborhoods within a 55 DNL CNEL contour or above. The Protecting Airport Communities from Particle Emissions Act would require the National Academy of Sciences to conduct a study on the sources, characteristics, dispersion, and potential health effects of ultrafine particles in communities around airports, which we've seen as an expressed concern nationwide. The study, I guess important here is the study called out a focus on large hub commercial airports such as Seattle, Boston, Chicago. And the study must look at potential health effects associated with elevated exposures. So for the Jackie Spears acts, obviously we have Kathleen on the line who knows these by heart, but I thought I would go through each one and just kind of summarize them and describe perhaps anything that we've done in terms of the technical working group or the ground-based noise subcommittee that may be applicable to some of these acts. So the first one's called the Respect Act, and this requires a number of things from FAA staff, but to answer questions submitted in writing by members of Congress within 90 days, it would require FAA staff to appear at a meeting or a town hall with a member of Congress with 30 days notice. And I believe Kathleen has talked about this before, and this was regarding some issues and regarding attendance and being responsive to requests from Congress, members of Congress. The REST Act allows airports, or would allow airports, to impose a curfew at any time between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. And permits penalties for curfew violations that exist at grandfathered in airports from ANCA. I know Peter talked earlier about ANCA and Part 161, and this really has to deal, it really gets to the heart of ANCA and those restrictions. Part 161, for those that aren't aware, is basically the study or mechanism or methodology, I should say, to examine the reasons why and provide a means to essentially persuade the FAA that an exception is warranted. No new curfew rule really could be adopted without the completion and approval or acceptance by the FAA through a study like that. But this is just worth noting in the context of this act. The Snore Act would establish a program to noise insulate 200 plus homes per year in specific areas, or provide financial support to cities impacted by noise as defined. It's worth noting here that per past presentations from SFO, I think there was a recent one at a regular meeting in which they provided an update that the amount budgeted by SFO for 2019 through 2023 was in the order of 16 million for sound insulation. And that's through their second chance and replacement programs that are a little bit different than what I would say, you know, your typical sound insulation program that's existing, say at San Diego currently, where they're initially going through the initial set of wait lists and homes within the 65. Typically a program such as San Diego, they're completing, you know, anywhere between 200 to 400 homes a year with an annual budget, usually, you know, somewhere between 12 and 18 million per year. So just providing a little context there. The Act gets at basically talking about the night hush procedures, which we have been actively discussing as part of our technical working group meetings. The last meeting being on March 24th, and I believe we have one coming up on May 26th, which will discuss further recommended next steps and really getting at the heart of some of the issues. I think at the time, and Kathleen, please correct me, but at the time this was written, I believe there's two approaches to, I guess, night hush. One would say a short-term approach and potentially a long-term approach. And the long-term approach is more for creating a complete new departure procedure. And that was part of SFO Roundtable's recommendations to the FAA, was that sort of direction as a long-term thing, knowing that a new departure procedure, if put through the process, the typical process, the IFP gateway, it could take a good amount of time, and good amount, it could be a couple years. And currently what is occurring, as for some of you that know, is that we're looking at changes or modifications to an existing procedure that would be implemented in the short term. That wouldn't require a process of going through and creating a new procedure, such as limiting certain hours, or altitude changes, or creating a flyby, flyover waypoint. Those type of things are modifications potentially to an existing procedure.
If that's a question to me, I thought I would.
Yes. Thank you. If you could.
Just to clarify what you just said in my mind, I don't think of it as short-term, long-term, because I don't see any distinction that needs to be made between what the FAA is currently proposing and what could be an ultimate solution. And the Roundtable has always recommended the use of the existing flight path to GOBS and then a southbound leg, and whether that southbound leg over the ocean, not crossing back over to land till at a much higher altitude. And there's no reason that could not be the FAA's proposal, which is basically to have aircraft vectored in a southbound direction over the ocean. And that would fulfill, I would think, all of the Roundtable's recommendations and be on the same timeline and could be a fairly permanent solution. So I don't necessarily see it as an either or. And yeah, so I think the Roundtable has a great deal of opportunity, I think, to interact with the FAA and see what the best process is going forward. And if there's any need to run aircraft back over the San Francisco North Peninsula when the ocean is sitting out there. And specifics on this particular bill, this has been rewritten to reflect the current, to reflect where we're at. Not so much the FAA
That's what I was
proposal,
wondering.
but just the fact that they have undertaken a certain, it's been rewritten. Yeah, so it's just that.
Thank you for that. I figured it would need to be, just because things have transpired since then.
Yeah, we got it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. The FAIR Act would amend the FAA's prioritization of U.S. airspace use. So safety would maintain the first priority. Second priorities would be to put noise and health impacts on an equal basis with efficiency. It would also require the FAA to update their mission statement to align with those priorities.
If I could just speak to that one, because
of course, yes.
That's my baby.
Thank you.
And
Okay.
That's, I think, the most important thing that we could do. I also think it's the least likely to be achieved in the near term, but nonetheless, I don't think you need to forego things that are aspirational and something you need to work towards. Right now, the mission statement and the mandate by Congress to the FAA is to prioritize airspace with safety as their first priority. No question, right? Everybody agrees with that. As their second priority, they are told to prioritize efficiency. Efficiency, period. That's it, safety, efficiency. And so you can see why we are all facing tremendous problems in working within the FAA, because they're following their mandate. And that mandate has been in effect, I used another day, for quite some time. And so this would, in effect, change the US code that tells them how to prioritize their airspace so that they would be required to take into consideration as a secondary priority, not touching safety, but as a secondary with efficiency, take into account as co-equal with efficiency, the effect on the community, whether that's noise, emissions, whatever it would be. And I think that's an important one. And if by any chance we could get that passed, it would be a game changer. It would outshine the NES as a game changer. So that it's great to have it on there. And as you probably know from some interaction with the Congress in the past, there are some bills that go through Congress and are reintroduced year after year after year after year. And eventually things catch at society and consciousness raising catches up with them and we get them through. So we hope it won't take that long, but we're in it for the long haul as well. That's all on this one.
Thank you, Kathleen. Yep. The Apprise Act. This would ensure community knowledge and input is representative in the flight procedure design process. And that goes through basically the process in which you put a procedure on the IFP gateway and they do an internal FAA review. So this would be that a roundtable representative, a technical representative would be allowed to fully participate in that process for procedures affecting their communities. The technical representatives will participate on the same terms and conditions as representatives from the airports, airlines, and procedure proponents. So this is really just including a representative, a technical representative in part of that process.
If I could make just one comment on that.
Yeah.
As you folks probably know, the PBN process, the performance-based navigation process, is, as Justin alluded to, takes place in a restricted environment, and it is open to obviously FAA staff. It's open to airline representatives, and it's open to airport representatives, and also in some cases procedure proponents who might be different from those categories, but generally are not. And this is important because the airport representative, we are told by the FAA, is supposed to represent the community that they serve or that surrounds them. But their interests may not always align, as we can expect. And there's no reason why another technical representative cannot be joined in from the roundtable into this process. There is a way, in addition to the people noted in here, airports, airlines, and proponents, there are many times where the FAA brings in other people who have knowledge. They'll bring in someone from the radio community who can talk about, transmission of signals or whatever they need to do to be assured of the procedure is going to be capably fulfilled. And so other people from industry are brought in as appropriate for making decisions on new procedures. And there's no reason that the community cannot be represented, especially when they've got a built-in technical advisory group or individuals who can sit in on these proceedings. It's not out of the question, and I think it has some possibility of bringing some transparency that the FAA has not heretofore afforded the communities.
Yeah, thank you. for that addition. The Notified Act. So this is if a new or modified flight path is proposed through a PBN process, the FAA would be required to notify councils, board of supervisors, member of Congress, roundtables within 5 miles of the flight path in question. And then it describes what the notification should be. And I think this gets at, you know, is part of the last one too, in terms of being part of the process, but also being notified in time to be participating in that. Right now, we are monitoring, or HOMH is monitoring the IFP gateway and doing those reviews in hopes of gaining insight as things are being published or changed through these procedures. But this would provide a mechanism to notify us of those potential changes. Kathleen, did you have anything to add to that one? No?
I guess one thing I would say is
Okay.
that for communities that don't have roundtables, this would be a way for their communities and their community
Good
leaders
point.
to be updated. And that's really, I think, important and a good point of sales to other members of Congress who have not always been informed in a timely manner.
Great point. Thank you. All right, and the Leave Act. I know Anne has probably been waiting for this one. But this is in regards to ground-based noise. If enacted, this bill would basically cause an action that would determine the amount of ground-based noise or identify a level of negative impact that would be caused by ground-based noise effects. Really what it's getting down to is creating some sort of standard that can be compared to determine if there is a impact. I hate to use the word necessarily impact, but is some sort of impact of ground-based noise in the vicinity, so that if you're conducting a study, such as one that was done for the ground-based noise subcommittee, the noise modeling study that was completed, that you would be able to compare that data to a standard and determine, you know, whether something was, you know, too high or above a limit, or exceeded a limit or whatnot. And that was one of the primary goals of the initial noise modeling study, was that it would create a foundation or base of, you know, data in terms of the noise model to have that and provide a level of understanding, which this act, I think, gets to, which is, you know, you would need to complete a study like that to determine what those levels are and whether something exceeded a certain particular impact or impact limit. And I think that's it from me. I tried to go as fast as I can because I know we were a little pressed for time. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Justin. Let me just go to the two other committee members for feedback, and then we'll move to Kathleen. Want to make sure we have time for public input at the end.
Yeah.
Mayor Schneider, do you have any questions or comments?
I think my one question for the last act that Justin just talked about, is there any chance that it's going to be reintroduced, and maybe that, hang on to that for when Kathleen comments. And then for all of these, and I'm looking at HR 5106, the REST Act, the Curfew Act, which we all know is highly unlikely. However, we're in hopefully soon a post-COVID world. One of the things we've learned from COVID is a number of populations were at even greater health risk. And largely that was lack of access to health, healthy eating, but also environment issues. So I think for all of these acts, COVID gives us an opportunity to pull and push health up as a criteria. Does that make sense to all of you? The studies that I'm hoping that we will see is a lack of sleep or interrupted sleep can damage the body's healing ability, making them more susceptible to a range of diseases. The daytime component of that is the interruption of noise and its impact on students and their ability to learn. And as all of us have been at home and not away at work for this during this COVID time, is what have those impacts to those people in those environments? I hate to say another study, but I think that these are things when you look at the COVID impacts and how do we become a healthier society that we should be looking at too.
If I could make a comment on that, Ann, I think that's an excellent point. Both the context of today's environment in terms of how we phrase the issue, and secondly, the importance of health overall. With respect to the studies, we may want to take an analysis of studies done by some of the medical institutions. I know from my work with the American Heart Association, they do have studies on the impact of sleep or lack of sleep on heart disease. And I'm betting that cancer may have something similar in other institutions. So they may have already done some of that work. And our connection then is to connect those studies, which link lack of sleep to disease, to the fact that the airports cause lack of sleep through the noise at night. So I think that's a great point, but we may already have some of those studies done by other institutions.
That's great. And thank you. I've added that for Michelle when we have our ground-based noise meeting, I think is July. I don't know if there's any time, but let's at least throw it on the draft agenda so we don't forget that. And through the chair, if I have one other thing, part of what I've been trying to grapple with and that COVID gave the opportunity is just how much noise our close-in cities are getting from 101. So in defense of SFO, not all the noise is from SFO. It's significant what is coming from 101. And I have turned to looking and dealing with Caltrans and trying to open the discussion of noise mitigation from the freeways. One of the difficulties is, to me, it feels like each transportation agency looks at its noise input alone. I know CEQA is supposed to balance the cumulative effect, but I think that it's lost. So whether it's in CEQA or in NEPA, the cumulative effect from multiple sources of noise is being drowned out. Pun intended, I think, on that. And I'm still trying to figure out how to put it in the right terms, but I think there's some big problems in NEPA and CEQA and different agencies passing the buck to each other. Yep. In a more blunt term.
Good. Councilwoman DiGiovanni, do you have any questions or comments?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just have a couple. First of all, thank you, Justin and Kathleen and the Congresswoman. Similar to what Councilwoman and Mayor Schneider referred to, and yourself, Chair, how is it that there's a curfew at the John Wayne Orange County Airport, but yet why isn't we don't have one? And as someone that lived in that area before, and it should not be socioeconomics or whatever, but I would like, at least we know there is one in California, so that could be a reference, or I don't know how we use it, or whatever. The other being that when we were discussing the health issues, is that it was brought to my attention in Daly City, and I don't know if in other cities, I don't know if it's been looked at, our first responders, our firefighters also at Engine 94 in Daly City have a strong impact of airplane noise and impact. And I know that they always get interrupted as well in their sleep, but to include them, and if there's other areas, I don't know if we've looked into that, that if our first responders are included in this, because I do believe as Mayor and our chair, we have been consistent, and you as well, and the Congresswoman are concerned about the health impacts. And then it raises that level of, we know that they get impacted anyway, but I know it's pretty heavy over in 94 in my area for our firefighters. So could we look into that, include them in those studies if anybody's interested? and also the curfew issue as well, Kathleen. And those are the 2 points that I have at the current time, Chair. And Kathleen, and appreciate everything. And please give my best to the Congresswoman, fearless, as you know, and with you, and tell her we got her. So these are some amazing bills. I'm willing to push as much as we can, because I think the one that you brought up at the fair, we need to do it. We got to do it. We just have to do it. It's for the communities, it's for the people, and that's why she sits in that seat and is still there. So we need to give her everything we've got, and I'm willing to do it. So thank you so much, and thank you, Chair and Mayor Schneider and Justin, and honored to be on this team. Thank you very much.
Chair Royce, I wanted to just call to your attention at 16 after, we still haven't heard from Kathleen Wentworth on the Quiet Skies, nor have we gotten any public feedback.
And thank you, Michelle.
We have 15 more minutes, now 14.
I appreciate that. Appreciate that. Kathleen, we're going to turn to you now and get your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I can briefly comment on Giovanni's last questions. The curfew issue for John Wayne, for San Diego Airport, all dates back to legislation back in the early 90s. And airports that had curfews or restrictions to landing at their airport of one kind or another were exempted. They were grandfathered in. So they were not covered under that legislation. There's maybe 5 or 6 of those airports. So yeah, too bad. We lost out on that one. But that isn't to say that that won't change in the future. That's what we're here to do. That's right. Okay, due to the time constraint, I'm going to just be very, very brief on this because I want to I'm scheduled to talk about the Quiet Skies briefing that took place last week. And as you know, the Congressional Quiet Skies is comprised of 40-something members of Congress, most of whom are around large airports that are noise-producing airports. And this Quiet Skies briefing meeting was scheduled for the staffers. And even if the members of Congress have an affinity and a desire to work on airport noise issues, they need to have their staffers, and there is quite a bit of turnover in DC. They wanted their staffers to be given a decent briefing. So that's really what this turned out to be. So the information presented there probably is not significant enough for a group like this that's been exposed to all of this. So I'm not going to go into any detail except to say the presentation was in 2 parts. One was done by the Congressional Research Service, which is basically not unlike what we just heard from Mr. Kirsch, going through all the legislation that's got us where we are, talking about FAA legislation that exists. And if that, I have a request in for me to be able to share that document, that PowerPoint. And if I am given the information, I will ask Angela to, I'll just send it to Angela for distribution as appropriate. The second part of the Quiet Skies briefing was the presentation made by 3 community advocates, one of whom this group knows quite well, Emily Trainter from NOISE. So I won't go into her presentation at all, except to say that it was as usual. It was talked about the advocacy they do and the good works that they do. The other 2 presentations were by people I had not been exposed to before. And one was Dr. Jamie Banks, who has a health background. And she is the president of the Quiet Communities, Inc. group. And they have quite a focus on health, quite a focus. And she luckily gave us, provided a written copy of her speech, which I reached out to her this morning, as well as to the number 3 advocate, and they both agreed that I could distribute their speeches. So I will be sending those to Angela after we get off this call. So that's the other 2. Ms. Tranter didn't have a written speech, but the other 2 did, so I will send you theirs. So Dr. Banks had a lot of stuff on health and a lot of references and resources. So I think that'll be really, really helpful given our last part of our conversation. The third presenter was Janet McEnany, who's president of the Queens, New York Quiet Skies. And she is quite outspoken, terrific personality person and has been at this game for some time, apparently. And she works quite closely with a lot of local groups back there. And she also has, from her group, a list of what their legislative proposals are for this year, basically their work plan for the year. So I will send that around as well to Angela. And I think that would be worth looking at. Of course, much of it may be local in nature, but the concept of it will be interesting. So I'll send out those without going into any more detail on them, except to say that I thought the advocates were very effective, and I think you'll enjoy reading their written statements. I wanted to briefly, and I will be brief, say that this morning I was given a copy of the FAA Administrator Dixon's response to the Quiet Skies letter that went out in March 10th of this year. So they finally got back to the Quiet Skies with the answer to a lot of things related to the neighborhood environmental study. And there's no great surprises here. There's a lot of verbiage. And I'll just highlight a couple of things that they said. And I'll just quote briefly here. While we continue to believe that the Neighborhood Environmental Survey demonstrated that DNL continued to be appropriate and has scientific utility, the FAA has not made any final decision on policy updates. So basically, don't hold your breath on that too long. Other than that, they say they're taking steps to begin a new policy review, and they want a new policy going forward, which must be evidence-based. They got more than 4,100 comments into the Federal Register regarding the Neighborhood Environmental Survey. And he says, where appropriate, the comments will be used to inform the scope of future research activities, including consideration of existing and alternative noise metrics. And we expect to review the continued use of day-night average sound level as the FAA's primary noise metric for assessing cumulative aircraft noise exposure. If we determine DNL will remain the primary noise metric, the FAA will review whether DNL 65 should remain as the definition of the limit for residential land use. We expect to explore whether supplemental or alternate noise metrics are appropriate to inform research and policy decisions. And we want to emphasize that the survey does not represent a shift in current policy. So that's just a few highlights from his 2-page letter. And I will send that to Angela as well when we get off. This just came in through this morning, so I haven't got anything more than that to tell you. But given the time constraints, I can take questions as we go, as may be appropriate. Or
I would tell you what, could I ask the members to hold their questions? I'd like to get public comment in, and then we'll come back to questions. So if we could open up for public comment, reiterating what I said earlier, push the raise hand feature or push *9. And do we have any public comments? Angela?
Thank you, Chairman. We do have 2 hands raised. I will first call on Rob Holbrook, followed by Darlene Yapling. So Rob, please accept this request to unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
Thank you. At 2 minutes before the deadline, I sent in a page of suggestions that you may wish to consider as you draft your letter for the Roundtable membership. I won't review everything there, but I will take this opportunity to identify a few of the points that could bear with a little bit more explanation. One of the ones that I suggested is that directionally, I believe that Congress may want to consider calling on the FAA to exercise their discretion, and I believe they have discretion, to adjudicate ANCA disputes in favor of communities. The fact that there hasn't been a curfew since ANCA was implemented doesn't mean that there couldn't be a curfew, as I understand it. It just means that the FAA has decided they're not going to allow any curfews. And in light of the Neighborhood Environmental Survey, they could revisit that, especially if there was, if they were encouraged to do so by Congress. Second, the way that I frame the Neighborhood Environmental Survey for my own purposes is that for whatever reason, in its wisdom, the FAA decided that a level at which 12.3% of residents are annoyed, highly annoyed by aircraft, is a level that merits special attention and, in fact, funding to mitigate the impacts of noise. That was previously thought to be at the 65 DNL contour. What the Neighborhood Environmental Survey has established is that that is nowhere near the place at which 12.3% of residents are annoyed today. In fact, that's probably out at 47 DNL. And so I suggest that noise assessments be required out to the 47 DNL contour. That has served policy for the last 40 years. The conservative thing to do would be to continue to use that going forward. And I suggest that the FAA also calculate and report the number of people that are highly annoyed in all contours at 47 DNL and up. Next, the FAA is down the path of allowing newly manufactured supersonic aircraft to fall short of stage 5 standards. I believe that should be reviewed. And finally, the stage criteria that are used to define acceptable noise for new aircraft measure aircraft noise at points very close to the airport. And this is leading manufacturers to game the system. The 737 MAX 808 actually affects twice as many acres on arrival as its predecessor, the 737-800. And I believe that's because those people are not counted in the noise metric and don't contribute to the advantage that stage 5 captures. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holbrook. Appreciate your comments. I think we had another hand raised, I think, Angela.
Yes, Chairman, we have one more. I will now call on Darlene Yapley.
Welcome,
Ms. Yapley,
Darlene.
please accept this request to unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
Thank you again for the work the Ledge Committee did on the NES comment letter, and I've based some of my input on that letter to address the comments. First of all, thank you for Rep. Spear and her active involvement, and I encourage her to reintroduce several of her bills, the night curfew, the roundtable tech expert to participate in the FAA procedure design, the FAA providing notification, and the need to have the FAA's mission to include noise and health impacts. One comment I'll make is they state that they're into efficiency. And if you remember, the DOT report showed that the NorCal Metroplex is the only Metroplex that has negative savings. So if they were supposed to do efficiency, they did not achieve it in NorCal Metroplex, which is all of us. Number two, the important thing is that the FAA or another agency protect communities. So if we don't get it in the mission, I hope that Rep. Spear will encourage Rep. Meng to reintroduce her bill to reestablish the EPA's Office of Noise and Abatement Control. Number three, I encourage Rep. Spear to support HR 712, and it's a National Academy's Health Impacts and Noise and Pollution study, and it is not new research. It puts its arms around all of the existing data points of science that affects health, and then publishes a report with recommendations. So I think this is what we need. We need to gather that up and understand what needs to be done moving forward. So hopefully Spear can support the bill that's been resubmitted. The next point is something that is new, which is in my A&E presentation, I mentioned that the significant impact definition is inadequate and one size does not fit all. And the results of the Schultz curve is been long-standing, but has been refuted with the new NES data. So in order to change soundproof funding, airspace redesign, federal reviews, et cetera, we need to have a look at this current standard. And I propose that the FAA commission the National Academies, which is independent, to recommend a system of metrics and thresholds that address different aircraft noise environments at the airport, near the airport, and far from the airport, because we can't leave that to the FAA. Another new item is that the ANCA scope is interstate, not intrastate. So this might be an angle. I know Mayor Schneider mentioned this about cargo night flights. can we not do something within state legislation about within California flights for cargo? We get a lot from LAX, San Diego, and so on. I have some other ones, but I'm running out of time. But just to let you know, it's reforming environmental review, drones that Sue Degray mentioned, and also the environmental justice space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your comments. Angela, are there any other hands raised by the public?
Mr. Chair, we do not have any more hands raised.
Thank you. Hearing that, we'll close the public comments and take it back to the committee. And Mayor Schneider, you had your hand up. You had some questions. Or
I know we're running out of time. I really like what was just said about cargo flights and in-state flights. That's great. I wonder if the other question I had with Mr. Holbrook's comments, I liked what he said. I'd like to dive deeper in it. Michelle, I know you're trying to make us realistic with staff time, but if we were to dive deeper in that, the problem I have is everybody always saying, oh, we're stage 5 aircraft now, it's so much quieter. Well, that all depends on what you're measuring and where you're measuring. So taking what I think Mr. Holbrook said and expanding it to include, well, what about during takeoff? What about in flight? What about arrival? How is that really working? And this is where Justin has to correct me. A stage 5 engine might be quieter, but if it's in a bigger, heavier plane, at least on low frequency noise, it's louder. So how do we get our hands around these perceptions that I think is why the FAA did a neighborhood study and didn't even look at the noise coming out the back of a plane. So I don't know if that's a working group thing or to bring it down to ground-based noise. And I know our work plan for the next fiscal year is the same. If there's a way to fit that in, or maybe see if anyone else around the country is looking at how to look at this. And I would love to see it mapped out. Not Darlene's comment about cargo and if there was any place to put a curfew, it's on cargo flights. If we had to start somewhere, can't we start with cargo? Then we'll deal with passengers trying to get to Chinese airports that have a curfew, but start somewhere on that. So thank you, public, for your comments, as always.
Thank
Chairman,
you.
I'm wondering, with it being 1:30, whether we should be getting clarification from Ms. Wentworth on the timing for this. That will help us to kind of decide next steps.
That's a good suggestion. Kathleen?
That's a great question, but I don't have an answer for you.
Okay.
You will be the first to know, folks. I promise you.
Well, but based upon your past history, is it better for us, and I'm talking about congressional implementation or opening of the discussions or timelines related to that, is it better for us to continue this to a next regular subcommittee meeting, which could be June or July, or to have a subcommittee work on something and present it to the membership in June, so it gets to you faster?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'm cognizant of staff time, but frankly, I would like to follow up on a number of the points raised. I mean, our mission is to discuss, understand, propose, or oppose legislation. And I think we had a number of comments today that would warrant our response to it. So I would like to follow it up. I heard about 7 or 8 things that I think the committee would like to have some input on or follow up on. In particular, what I heard was support for Congressman Spiro reintroducing most, if not all, of her 8 pieces, and a request for how we can help on that on a more proactive basis. Secondly, I'm interested in the letter that came from the FAA director back out that you referred to, Kathleen, what the next steps might be from us to respond to that letter, because I'm not sure I liked what I heard, frankly. Thirdly, I think we need to have some more focus around the health aspects and what the lobbying efforts should be around that. Fourth, I'm very interested in what actions could be taken by the state and whether or not that's something we ought to push for in Sacramento. 5, I think the local, I had a couple of cities had local ordinances with local metrics. I'd like to understand that more. If that's something that we should explore that might be effective. And then the community of interest to me was interest too. What, what the legislation might be around that and how that works. And I'm sure Ann and Pam and others had other comments, but those are off the top of my head, Michelle, that if we can make a list of those and just maybe have a meeting in June or July to do the next steps. And actually the agenda would be, what do we do with what we've heard today? I think is what we're talking about. Does Ann or Pam, do you have any feedback on that? Any thoughts?
I liked everything you said, Chair, and today was actually a really incredibly good meeting. So staff, thank you. And to all the speakers, it's a lot to absorb for those of us who are part-time and we bounce from topic to topic, but I agree completely, Al.
Okay, Pam?
And I'm in total agreement, and I think that we got to keep pushing.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody and Michelle and staff, Kathleen, everyone.
Michelle, do you have enough feedback from us or?
I do.
Okay, okay.
Perfect.
Any last comment from members of the committee or members of the staff with respect to anything we talked about to date? Hearing none, I want to thank the public comments and I want to thank the committee members. And I particularly want to thank our presenters. Kathleen, thank you so much. Justin, and Peter's left, but and thanks to the staff, Michelle in particular, for organizing all this. I know much work goes into this. And I also know a lot of the work now will happen with the follow-up. So thank you so much. And appreciate it. And with that, we stand adjourned. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.